you in this
Yeah.
way.
Yes. Yeah. Virtually.
Yes, exactly. But you're not blurry or anything, so that's good.
You're a little blurry, but I think you'll grow out of it.
I think so. I know. I think you're going to help me, lead me out of the blur. Is that it?
I'll do my best.
Okay.
Well, as always, thank you, Alan. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, everyone, for coming. This is our final event, which is really exciting, and I'm very happy with the level of participation and engagement we've gotten. So that's huge, and thank you. It's made this really worthwhile. I'm going to just jump into it, and I have some notes. Don't look at them.
Okay. Yeah. That would be cheating.
Basically, like at first blush, it seems kind of unusual to be pairing Patrick in a conversation with Alan when you consider what you're known for first line, which is you're an artist who works with printmaking, with sculpture, and then you're a critic who works primarily in photography. You might have frozen. Can you move? Okay, you're good. Okay. Yeah, you're fine. But then when you start to really look at your careers, and I sent them silly Venn diagrams yesterday of like, oh, look at all the cross sections. This is what I'm thinking about our talk. You start to see how many hats you both wear. Mm-hmm. And so there's teacher, there's curator, there's critic, there's writer, there's artist. And as you start to unfold these things, clearly there's a whole lot of terrain that we can mine for just a general discussion. And so in the spirit of every talk that's happened here, I'm keeping it pretty open. Mm-hmm. I do have a few really broad questions, but as always, I really would love if people just decide to jump in. If they have comments or questions, just flag me and I'll make sure you get the microphone so Alan can hear you. And what I would maybe begin with is, rather than me giving a bio, which I have found incredibly awkward in past situations here, I would just ask each of you to give us a little bit of an auto bio regarding your practices, your trajectories, where you've gone, with criticism, with art in general, and we'll go from there. So sure. I'll leave it maybe to Alan to start, and then pass it off.
Great.
Okay. Well, very briefly put, I'm a working critic, historian, and to some extent, I suppose, theorist of photography. I also write about new digital technologies as they impinge on that. I've been doing this since 1968 for a variety of publications, outlets, platforms, everything from the Village Voice, New York Times, New York Observer, newspapers, to assorted art and photography magazines, other kinds of publications, and since 1995 on the web, primarily at websites that I've published myself, including my blog, Photo Critic International, but also at other websites as well. And one place where I actually sort of cross paths with Patrick is that one of the main influences on me very early, before I actually started writing about photography, was a book by William Ivins, who was the curator of prints and drawings at the Metropolitan Museum in the, I guess, up through the late 1950s, if I remember correctly. Wonderful book called Prints and Visual Communication, yeah. which you probably know, Patrick, and which was a big influence on Marshall McLuhan. And it was also in many ways a big influence on me in its understanding of the function of the print, meaning the image in multiple, as a vehicle or a platform for mass communication, as distinct from painting, let us say, or a drawing, which really only reaches a small audience and in one place at one time. Ivins really didn't get photography in many ways, I think. So he's not as useful in his commentary about photography as he is in his commentary about the previous graphic arts media, but in those areas he's absolutely brilliant. Woodblock, etching, engraving, etc. And in terms of their social function, and that had a lot of effect on me as a young critic, and it has continued to be a reference point for me ever since. So we do share, I suspect, a good bit of common territory, but that's at least one place where we could start.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's really, really interesting, and I think you know, I sort of came to Ivan's, funnily enough, through Walter Benjamin, and it wasn't directly, obviously, through Walter Benjamin, but I think you know, when I had sort of, in some sense, exhausted my way of kind of engaging with the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, somehow I came across Ivan's, and not only did I find that really helpful to me as a kind of print media artist, somebody trying to sort of think through some of the issues around multiplicity and indexicality, etc. But it filled in a kind of a whole gap, I think, in thinking that oftentimes people who talk about printmaking aren't able to kind of play out. And also I think that there's something that seems to kind of give, for me anyway, a kind of a structuralist way to kind of talk about printmaking and think about it so that it doesn't become this kind of delimited kind of field, like basically a ghetto, which oftentimes it is in modern art. So yeah, my own background, you know, I guess I finished my BFA in 1979. So you know, I've been doing various kinds of art things ever since then.
Jeez, you're practically a geezer.
Exactly, I know. But you know, so I call myself an artist, but I did make my own little Venn diagram when you said I had to introduce myself. And so as an artist, you know, I think of that as a teacher and a producer, and then instead of writer or curator, I put a discourser. And then I thought, well, the discoursing part is really part of everything I do, but I actually do think that, you know, I try not to separate out, you know, my kind of intentions as a maker from my intentions as I say, a kind of a discourser. And I think that's in part because for me, artists do, in large part, artists work with theory through the work that they make. And so for me, but for me, that's a very discursively related kind of activity. So I'm an artist, but you know, I think as an agent, as an art, if you will, you know, some of that is collaborative and some of that is individual. And in terms of platforms, and this is kind of shifting a bit, but the platforms are the museum, the commercial context, the academy, and also whatever this is. I suppose it's the academy in some sense. And I was thinking about, you know, if I looked at this on a flow chart, and this probably relates somewhat to age, I would say that, you know, some of the lines in terms of emphasis kind of go up at certain stages, and some of the lines dip. And I do think that, you know, at my advanced age, I sort of feel like I actually have more I'm interested in trying to do as an individual, maybe even legitimately do as an individual, than I did 20 years ago. Even though I think the art world would tell you, maybe it was telling us a little less this 20 years ago, that you had to be this kind of screaming kind of individual kind of soul, you know, ego. You know, I never sort of believed that so much. I always kind of felt like there, you know, I had to kind of really be operating in a kind of broader landscape. Now at this age, I am actually interested in the possibility of making more individual works, but I actually don't think that that's kind of anathema to the way I've thought about what it is to be an artist, I guess. Anyway, so maybe that's a little bit too much about me as opposed to my influences, but I appreciate the Ivan's connection for sure.
Excellent. Well, no, it's not too much information. That's okay. Wonderful, and it's right in vein with my upcoming question. And for this general panel, I read through your essay, Destructive Business, Alan, which was Destruction Business, pardon me. And I also looked at a few recent essays in a new book that Patrick has out, which I should connect you with.
I'll send you one.
Okay, thanks.
Fine. Great. And so basically, in Destruction Business, Alan, you talk about the critic as an active civilian, somebody who engages their civic responsibility in a public forum. You talk about the critic as an interviewer, a biographer, a historian, a theorist, a eulogist, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that this is very much also true of the artist. You're playing with a lot of different balls, like you're throwing them all up in the air. And so many of the quotes that I pulled out of a number of essays from your book, Patrick, I also found doubly applicable to the critic when you were talking about art. There was one in particular in an essay by Anne Bryden, saying the precariousness of the attempt to do or say something through art. That was like a snippet that I pulled, and I think that that precariousness extends to criticism as well. This idea of putting yourself out there in a public forum. Bryden also mentions that mere critique is no longer going to produce radical change, which connected with something in a different essay, Patrick, you had said, saying, I want to solve art problems, and later I also want to solve social human problems. So my giant overarching question to begin with is regarding the social, the economic, the political, the spiritual, the humanitarian, all of these kind of spheres. What can the critic, artist, discourser do? What can the theorist do? What should they be doing? What must they be doing at this stage, do you think? We'll see there.
Do you want me to start?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I would actually, I think, I'm not saying you misquoted me, but I think in the point I made or was trying to make is I think I said I want to engage with human problems, social problems, but as an artist, I can really only solve art problems. And so, and I'm not saying that if I just kind of deal with kind of formal principles, somehow that will make an address to sort of social programs and situations. But I do think that, you know, inferentially there's a connection between the problems that artists take up in their studio, and I mean those can be multiple and myriad, and I can't obviously describe them all, but I do think that those really do speak in a certain sense directly to social issues, but I wouldn't want to be thought to be saying that I as an artist can actually literally and directly engage social issues, unless that's part of my practice, unless I'm doing relational work, and I believe that that's quite, you know, that can be quite a legitimate way to work. It's not a way that I'm working.
Right.
One other thing I would say is I've been really interested more recently in the idea of the artist as citizen. And I had this amazing experience when I was working with a group of artists, and some of them were Inuit artists from northern Canada. And at a certain point we were having a conversation, and William Noah, who's a very senior Inuit artist, was talking about his father, who had been also an artist. And I asked him, well, how was it that your father came to be an artist, or how did he know he was going to be an artist, or, you know, how did that happen? And he said, well, he was a great hunter, and he was a community leader, therefore he was a great artist. And I thought, you know, that's so kind of antithetical to the way that we think in certainly the modern West about the artist as a kind of specialist, and often in the West certainly a kind of marginal specialist. And you know, I get the history that brings us to that moment, but I don't think that it's necessarily possible to, or maybe I should say it this way. I think for me it's more interesting, and I think maybe some of the urgencies of the times in which we're living suggest that artists need to think of themselves more broadly as citizens. Not that they're necessarily going to go and sort of run for public office, but somehow the idea that we're kind of engaged in this kind of rarefied or highly specific activity that isn't like the kinds of activities other people are engaged in the world, for me is just really way too reductive. Yeah. So I'll leave it there.
That's great.
Yeah.
Alan, would you like to respond?
Yeah, that's very interesting anecdote you relate there. It makes me think of something that is a line from Thomas Harris, who says, "Problem solving is hunting. It is savage pleasure, and we are born to it." And I think of that often because, in many ways, although God knows, I do not think of myself as a hunter. You know, certainly not in the way your Inuit friend's father was. But much of what I'm doing is problem solving, and it is a kind of hunting. and it is a savage pleasure, and I do think we are born to it. It is what we do as humans, and I think art making is or can be a kind of problem solving. It in many cases it's not a problem that existed before you decided it was a problem. Certainly with art, that's true. But the fact of the matter is, nonetheless, that you're trying to figure something out. You're trying to find a way to actualize something that you envision, and that involves solving all kinds of problems from the technical and artisanal on up to the to the conceptual. It's interesting that you speak of the artist as citizen, because in the essay that Ruth is quoting from of mine, The Destruction Business, I talk about criticism as basically an act of citizenship within a given community. And I have long thought of it that way, and see what I'm doing basically as a kind of fundamentally responsible citizenly behavior within the community that I'm active in, which is broadly put the sort of photo art community. And I don't differentiate that in my head from my own responsibilities to my neighbors, to my fellow citizens in the community that I live in. It's pretty much part and parcel of the same. It's not just a matter of living here. It's not just a matter of voting every 2 years or every 4 years. It's a matter of involvement with the ethical and creative and moral and intellectual life of whatever group of people I've made a commitment to. So I, and again, it's not a matter of necessarily running for office, and I can't envisage myself doing that, although I have this sort of self-appointed position as a moral arbiter. But the only authority that I have, and I think the only authority that you have as an artist citizen, is the credibility that my work, or in your case your work, gives you as such. I mean, maybe to some extent, if other people approve your work or approve my work, then we accrue, I mean, people of influence, then we accrue certain authority as a result of that. But if we talk about our relationships to our audiences, in my case to readership, in your case to a viewership, the only credibility we have is what results from them engaging with our work directly, and in whatever way one does that, either with a piece of critical writing or a work of art, putting it to the test. So, and I like that. I'm fine with that. I've never for exactly that reason, I've never spoken in the editorial we. For example, I've always spoken in the first person and written in the first person, as a discourser, to use your interesting term. I've never wanted to pretend that anything stands behind me as an authority, the sort of royal we, or the third person. I mean, I use those locutions occasionally, but I use them purposefully, not generically. So I write as I, and always have, and I'm very comfortable with that. It discomforts some people, I've learned, who respond to it as if, well, but it's all about you. But that's not really the point of it, to be all about me. But I could understand how some readers might feel that, and might be more comfortable with a kind of neutral, impartial, seemingly distanced persona speaking to them. I think that's a matter of sort of readerly taste, and I accept that. But my choice is, if I alienate some people with the use of the first person, I do. But I want people to read me with the knowledge that this is coming from an individual who is issuing his individual opinion, and it is mutable over time, and it is not the voice of God, and it's not the voice of some impartial authority. It's the voice of me, basically. So, and I see that also as a kind of aspect of citizenship. I don't represent anybody except me. I don't even think I represent the people who agree with me, frankly, because I tend to suspect that they're as likely to disagree with my next article as they are to agree with this article, and that's also fine. So
Well, the thing that comes to mind, and I totally agree with what you're saying, but the thing that comes to mind is that you're talking about really the work we do as, in a certain sense, enacting our citizenship through the doing. I mean, I guess the praxis, and there's a way in which I think using the I, or me making a work and actually doing the important thing and putting it out there, is a form of activism. And so, I mean, I think the I is a kind of activist position you're taking. And at the same time, I don't think one can't, or one needs to deny a position of activism just because they make a painting. I think it may be a little
right.
harder to kind of register what the activist gesture is in the work of a painter, but I don't think that, or a printmaker, but I don't think that there's any necessary disengagement. In fact, I think that can be a really engaged form of citizenship, especially as you describe it. This is a bit of a digression, but it really is about something I want to say. It's really about that not kind of working as if the kind of the rubric artist or critic comes with any guarantee of anything, or any legitimation that is for all time. There was something on the CBC radio last week, and it was a speech from an opera singer who was addressing the class at Juilliard, and she said, I have to tell you, you will never make it. Because real artists never make it. There's always the next thing. There's always the thing that you're going to need to do following the one you've just done. And I mean, I think an artist or a critic really needs to kind of operate in that mindset where, I mean, when people see my work, I always, it's inevitable. Artists always say, well, you should see what I'm doing in my studio now.
Right.
It's sort of like the problem's partly solved here, and you might even like this, but I'm telling you, I'm so much closer with what I'm doing now, or what I'm going to do. And of course, I mean, there's a kind of hubris in that too, I suppose. But I think that the paradigm of being the engaged citizen who continues to try and solve the problem or find a way to speak, seems to me to be the only kind of position for an artist, a critic, to take in order to keep going. And on the other hand, I mean, you get people whose works, whose writing has a kind of is kind of branded, basically. And some of that can sometimes be interesting. It certainly works in the marketplace in ways, but oftentimes, you're getting a kind of regurgitation of something you already know, or you already know they think. So I think as an artist, I can only speak as an artist in this case, to find that line between making work that's maturing and is gaining a kind of visibility, but is also not sort of petrified, to use the name of the gallery here, but not as petrified in a kind of identity unto itself, is a real sort of, that's an important challenge, I think.
Yeah, I think critics go through, well, can go through things like that. I'm not sure that they do. I mean, I have colleagues who have happily, in a certain way, written the same essay for 50 years. Hilton Kramer wrote the same essay for 40 years, meaning wrote the same way in the same style. Mostly exhibition reviews and book reviews. So that I think there are times when internally, some of us at any rate feel a need for some kind of challenge. I'm reminded of a story about Miles Davis that Herbie Hancock tells in a documentary that I saw. I'm a major fan of Miles Davis up through about late 1950s, early 1960s, and then he goes electronic and fusion and all this other stuff, and he kind of loses me. I listen to it sometimes to try and figure out what he was about, but it doesn't grab me in the way that the earlier music did. But he was talking to Herbie. But I don't know if you know your jazz, but in the 1950s, Miles was running one of the classic bop quintets with John Coltrane and several other people, Paul Chambers and Red Garland and Philly Joe Jones, a great group, and they would put out a couple of albums a year, 2 or 3 albums a year, and every album would have Miles playing a muted American songbook classic from Lerner and Lowe or Rodgers and Hart or whatever, slow, muted trumpet. And they were just glorious. Each and every one of them was absolutely glorious, right? And then Miles went in this other direction, and he lost a lot of his audience when he did that. And he gained new audiences, but he lost a lot of his old audience when he did that. And to some extent, he even lost me, although I respected him trying something, right? But he said something really valuable to Hancock that Hancock relayed in this in this interview. He said, I won't try to imitate Miles' voice, but he said, Herbie, do you know why I had to stop playing those ballads? And Herbie said, no, Miles, why? And Miles said, because I loved playing them so much.
Wow.
You know? And I know that resonates, you know, in terms of what you were just saying, right? I mean, you can become so good at something that it becomes a kind of trap. That being that good at it becomes a kind of trap, and you just want to go on doing it and doing it and doing it, and at some point you become a tribute band to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
Well, you know, and it is, you know, there's that line you I guess of advice you're supposed to give to writers. You know, if you write a line you really love, you have to take it out. And
Right.
I've said that to artists in their studio sometimes, but it's a little bit of a harder thing to figure out how to say to somebody who is making a painting, because on some level, if the desire, or if, you know, if some really kind of urgent motivation, semi-urgent motivation isn't there, and something like love of what you're doing isn't operative, then you probably can't do it at all. And at the same time, I think as an artist, you definitely have to do your work, and you need to do the work that is yours to do. And you know, I see this often. You know, I look around and I see work I would love to be doing, and some days I'd way rather be doing somebody else's work than mine. But I know that, and sometimes I think it is important for an artist to actually sort of throw everything away, change tracks, actually make a radical break. I think that is important and necessary sometimes. I think, on the other hand, the somewhat maybe even harder thing to do is to, in a serious way, do your work without simply repeating yourself. And you know that, and so I think there the paradigms probably shift a little bit, vis-a-vis writing and what goes on in the studio. But I think that the spirit of what we're talking about is pretty similar.
Yeah, I do. I do too. You know, I understand, going back to printmaking, that Japanese woodblock printmakers used to develop a style, bring it to a certain height, a certain peak of achievement, and then not only change the style but change their name.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's true. It's sort of anecdotal, because I haven't really studied a lot about Japanese printmaking. But I love that idea. You know, that you'd get to be really good at something, and then you'd start over, basically, completely, reputation, whatever, you know, tabula rasa, and let's begin again. Because I understand that attitude, and I feel a little bit like that myself, you know, without comparing myself to Hiroshige, let's say. But I understand how you could do that, and what the rewards would be, and what the price would be that you would pay, obviously, for that. So it's something I really respect. My sense is that in many ways, you know, that there's a difference on some levels between what an artist is doing in the studio and what a critic is doing, because there are artists who are extremely private, right? I mean, Emily Dickinson basically wrote for an audience of one or two. You know, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who was the editor to whom she sent her work, but I mean, she had no interest in achieving a public or even in being published. You know, she was happy to put her poems in her drawer or her suitcase or her locker or wherever she kept them, right? And share them with only one person or two people. I don't think you're ever going to find a trunk full of unpublished critical manuscripts that somebody did because they really were just doing it for themselves. Yeah. I can't imagine it, right? Because it is by its nature a public act, right?
Yeah.
I don't think anybody becomes a critic unless they intend to publish. Which doesn't mean that people don't function critically in their relation to things, obviously, including art. But I don't think that that anyone puts it down on paper and sorts it out and polishes it and then puts it away and says, well, I'm not writing for now. I'm writing for the future. Or some of those things that you hear artists say. And I'm not trying to be sarcastic here about artists. I think I think it's different. I think that art making often is done initially for private reasons.
Yeah, I would say so. I would also say, especially I think for younger artists, well, anyway, I'll speak for myself. I think that, there's the imagined audience, and I'm not sure that that exists quite so much now, because I think the market as the place where you're trying to find an audience, or you're trying to get into the market so you'll have an audience and collectors. I think that's become, for many artists, even young artists, quite a standard. But I know in my own experience, when I first was an artist and I was moving around a bit, oftentimes my imagined audience was the group of people in the place I had just left. I wanted to kind of show them, or I wanted to actually kind of figure out what I could do that would really kind of speak. And I think that was a really valuable way of, I don't know if it's valuable, but it was a kind of intense way of developing a practice that you do on your own, but with this sense that it's for something or somebody. And I imagine with
Hi, we back?
question, do you think that kind of the person or the persons to whom you're speaking when you're writing, I mean, is that something, number one, conscious for you, and is it something that's changed over time in your practice?
That's a good question. Am I coming through okay? You're starting to get static here.
No, you're good on our end.
I'm good. Okay. Well, I mean, and I don't know again how much this applies to a visual artist, although it may. But as a writer, I've had different platforms, right? Ranging from the New York Times or the Village Voice, which went out nationally, to a very diverse audience. I would say an educated audience, mostly probably a sort of college-educated audience, with an interest in the arts, at least the parts of the New York Times that I was writing for. An obvious interest in the arts and leisure section. On to specialized magazines, like Popular Photography, right, or Camera 35, or some more sophisticated photo magazines, what we would call little magazines, vis-a-vis little poetry magazines, with a much narrower readership, but a much more informed readership, and then all kinds of other publications. So big audiences, small audiences, diverse audiences, narrowcast audiences, etc. And to some extent, if I'm writing something specifically for one of those publications, I have an image in my head of who those readers are. That it doesn't mean it's a true image, right? Yeah. It could be completely wrong, but it does affect the kind of writing that I do. For example, if I'm writing for a photo magazine, whether that's a magazine like Popular Photography or a more narrowcast magazine for people with a real deep interest, like Hot Shoe in England or the Photo Review here in the East Coast, I won't necessarily explain in any detail what let's say a platinum print is. Yeah. Because they'll know, right? Yeah. And I can use certain terms, not jargonized, but just certain vocabulary, and assume a certain set of reference points, especially if I'm writing for one of the more sophisticated magazines, reference points in the history of photography, for example, etc. That I wouldn't assume if I was writing for popular photography, and that I wouldn't assume if I was writing for the Village Voice. So I would gloss those things. You know, I would give some brief explanation of what a platinum print was, not necessarily every time, but if I was writing a column for the New York Observer, periodically I would, you know, indicate what this was or that was, so that anyone who was at least reading me regularly but didn't know much about photography, which would often be the case in a periodical like that, wouldn't have to look it up, basically. So there's that. At the same time, I've actually written and published an essay in a magazine that UNESCO used to publish called Impact of Science on Society, about the lens, the prehistory of the lens before photography. And I've published that same essay, just stripping out its footnotes, in a magazine called Lens on Campus that used to be given away in bulk to high school and college level photo students. Same essay, absolutely no change in the language, right? Just the deletion of the sort of you know, the scholarly apparatus, or incorporating anything that was necessary into the text itself, because they didn't publish footnotes. So I have developed a style that is very adaptable to multiple environments, and I have no idea how to tell you how I did that. It just sort of evolved. It evolved that way, possibly, and we've talked about this in previous sessions, because I come out of a background in creative writing, and a background in journalism, and so I'm just used to writing for what I think of in my head is the average reader. Now, I do have to say, maybe this is the last thing I'll say on this at the moment, that that image of the average reader, which I think used to be correct when I started out, that is the average reader of the Village Voice, New York Times, etc. What I used to think of that person as a person with a good high school education and an interest in the subject, and now I probably have to say it's going to be a person with a good college education and an interest in the subject, because the basketball hoops have been lowered so much that the vocabulary level that I would have expected from an intelligent high school graduate in 1965 or so would now be the vocabulary level of a college graduate.
Yeah. I appreciate your thoughts on this, and in a sense it strikes me, you know, not to be over flattering, but it strikes me as a very generous way of thinking about what your job is, as it were. And now I'm going to say something I think that is about a kind of, almost like a kind of a divide I'm seeing between that kind of generosity and what I sometimes see happening in the contemporary art world. But maybe people here have thoughts about this. I could say in a kind of disparaging way that it seems as if there are certain kind of trends or trajectories in the contemporary art world where artists are interested in basically making work whose references are really intentionally going to be quite unavailable to the vast majority of people. And that seems as if it's intended to, you know, sort of place the work in a more rarefied kind of, you know, place within the art world. I mean, that's a kind of a reductive way to think about it. If I think about it a little more broadly or broad-mindedly, I would say that there are people who are working like that. I think there are also people who actually believe, and maybe rightfully so, that they're working, you know, in a number of registers, and that, you know, they may have a set of a very particular interests that they're bringing to the work, but they also have, you know, a degree of generosity about the way that they're proceeding, so that they actually also have something like faith in the possibility that this work is going to reach a broader audience, even if they don't necessarily have access to all the, you know, the more specific references. I could say that I think, you know, in general, I don't think this is a bad thing, but I think it does start to bespeak how um, in a certain sense, in terms of broader kind of cultural conversations, how particular and sometimes rarefied is the world of visual arts. Now there's a big market for it and people go to biennials, but how much people actually are interested in engaging with art, I'm not so sure. I mean, I think people do read criticism, I think people do go to galleries, but I think in a way, artists sometimes are perhaps, maybe for their own intellectual survival, are making works that they truly don't hope will reach a broader audience. And, by the same token, the art world is in essence not for a broader audience, certainly outside of major art centers, and certainly here in London, Ontario, we're outside of a major art center. So, I don't know if this is leading anywhere helpful. I mean, you might have a thought on this, or maybe people here have thoughts, because I don't think I don't think it's a kind of insidious or a kind of mean-spirited approach, but I do think it's one that is placing a lot of contemporary art out of reach of even those college-educated people who have some interest. And maybe what we're asking them to do is work a little harder, and that's not a bad thing. Or maybe we are saying, you're not going to get this because you really are outside the important parts of the conversation anyway.
Well, I don't want to come across as an advocate of, I don't know what to call it, populist art or readily accessible art or art that everyone can enjoy, because or for that matter, as an advocate of criticism like that. I mean, obviously, to read me usefully, I think you need a range of reference points, for example, that the average person won't have, and I'll try in various ways to deliver those, on a sort of as needed basis within a given essay. But you can't just do that. You can't reiterate your reference points essay by essay by essay, because it'll take up all the space. So I think that that even work that is on some levels accessible will have layers that will be available to people. I mean, if it's really a rich work, it'll have layers that are available to people who know more.
Mm-hmm.
Number one. And number two, there is work that is just, it is not for the average listener, or let's qualify that. It's not for the average listener or reader at that time, at that moment. Right? I mean, Cubism, let's just think about Cubism, right? Cubism was not art for the people, right? This was a radical intervention in the fundamental idea of representation at that particular moment, right? And what Cubism basically said was, for hundreds of years, thousands of years, we painters, we graphic artists have been arguing or proposing to you viewers that the way to apprehend the thing is to stand in front of it for a long time and stare directly at it. And that's how you apprehend the thing. And we got something different for you. The way you apprehend the thing is you move around it, you look at it from a lot of different perspectives, and you mush all that together into this collage of perceptions. Now that's a radical idea, and it shocked the hell out of, I mean, I'm obviously simplifying the Cubist idea, but that's a sort of nutshell version, right? And so you got people laughing at Duchamp, explosion in a shingle factory, all of that kind of stuff, right? But 25 years later, it's everywhere. And now today, this is sampling in hip hop. This is collage, everything collage. This is the idea is taken for granted, 100 years later. So there are ideas that are initially very, very difficult and challenging to people that work their way into the ecosystem of the culture and just become part of it. And there are other things that were difficult then, and they're difficult now, and they may be difficult 100 years from now. And that's all fine. You know, it's. I mean, I'm not. I really don't want to sound as if I believe that everything should be available to everybody, because I don't agree with that. And I think that's fine with criticism. I think it's fine with art. There are, you know, you know, Giorgio Morandi did what Giorgio Morandi did, right? And some people will understand and appreciate that, and a great many people will not, and that's perfectly okay. That we have artists like that, um, but he didn't. I guess the key point would be he didn't paint that way to keep people out,
Right.
right? That I mean, it wasn't a gatekeeping idea that you know, it was simply, this is what I want to do, and I'm not doing it to impress anybody, and if you know, if you enjoy what I do, then enjoy what I do. But I see a lot of, especially the criticism, but I think a lot of the art making now as a kind of gatekeeping function, and that disturbs me, because I'm not an advocate of populism, but I'm also not an advocate of elitism per se, right?
Yeah, that's helpful in that, and I appreciate your having kind of acknowledge that some of what I'm saying might sound as if I'm lauding your populism. I would say, if artists are taking their job seriously in terms of doing research and development, we'll call it, then if we take your cubism example, that came out of research and development that not only needed doing, but it really made a difference. And so in that sense, I think artists do have a responsibility to be doing, among other things, research and development and showing it to people. And if some of that it involves a level of gatekeeping or kind of insistence that the public is not meant to get this, and it sets up a kind of a hopeless kind of situation for people in terms of having access to where culture is going, then I think for me that's disappointing. I think on the other hand, I'm all for work that's difficult and challenging to people, because I know that in 99% of cases it's like that because it's of its time. And I think, in that sense, I don't know if it's a good thing, but it is what it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed.
I wonder, to shift the discussion a little bit and turn it to audience, you mentioned at one, nice cat, you mentioned at one point a disappointment as a critic with an audience who, while they would read something and you said give you little like backstage, I really agreed with it, they weren't participating in a public way, and they weren't engaging in your discourse in a way that you felt was productive. And then I would go a little further back even to this idea of art as being inaccessible. And so then is there whether it's for the reasons that you were just discussing, or whether it's this kind of age-old ivory tower of the art institution, is there a responsibility on the part of the critic or the artist or the discourser to really try to pull that response out of your audience, or to even expect it? And if you don't, have you failed? Do you feel personally that you failed, or do you just continue on?
Well,
I need to evacuate a cat.
It's so distracting.
Nice, yeah.
He's on the computer. There's wine and stuff if you guys want wine.
Bye, Kitty.
So I guess just to add to that, are we looking for a response from beyond, our group of critics, our group of artists? Are we looking for a broader societal response?
Well, to the larger question you asked, I would say that I would never want, as an artist or as somebody who's teaching artists, I would never want to kind of imply that we have this kind of earnest responsibility to help out the audience, if you will. So, you know, I do think that, I mean, we have to make our work. We will be conscious of an audience, although I don't necessarily think we're responsible to ensure that they connect with our work. Although there's a certain amount of work happening now where I think the artist is actually taking direct responsibility for trying to connect the work with the audience, but I'm not sure that actually makes any difference. So yeah, I would resist something like a kind of insistence on that level of earnestness. I think I am either idealistic or romantic minded enough to say that I actually believe if you show people a work and the work has some level of generosity or some level of availability, even if it's really complicated and perverse, I think people will pick up on that. So, and maybe I am being overly idealistic. So, I guess what I'm saying is, I think if artists make work in good faith, somehow the public, the audience, will have access to something which is not merely and totally off-putting. And maybe that's all one can hope for. I mean, I hope that it's operating on multiple levels, and I hope that there are some informed viewers. And I hope that some of the uninformed viewers want to become informed because the curiosity that the work invokes or provokes is enough to kind of get them going. So yeah, I think that's sort of where I think that problem or tension lives for me.
Well, as a critic, I'm from my standpoint, by definition, working for an audience. Right? Who that audience is may vary. If I had my absolute druthers, I'd have a platform like the Times or the Village Voice or the New York Observer. I'd be in or a magazine like Rolling Stone or Harper's. I don't know if that maybe Maclean's up there.
Yeah.
Right. That is, I'd have a regular platform which I value enormously. I mean, to be able to reach the same readers week after week after week, and this is, I think, different for a visual artist. I'm pretty sure, but to be able to have the same readers week after week after week, month after month, year after year, to be able to build a line of reasoning. To be able to establish a set of reference points, so you don't have to repeat yourself, all the time. And that sense, to become a sort of a part of people's intellectual, cultural lives, is it's an enormous gift, right? And I've had that gift given to me and have had it taken away or lost it a number of times over my professional life. And the gift is enormous, and the loss is enormous every time it happens. So in that sense, I have some image in my head when I'm writing for a publication like that of who the readership is, and it may be a realistic image or not, but I think it's probably approximate. I mean, I do meet readers, and have a sense of how my work is affecting them. So I think that it's in the nature of being, or can be in the nature. It's in the nature of my being a critic, anyhow, that I'm aware of audience and trying in some way to show them a good time. It's the best way I could put it. I want them to have a good time, and so I make jokes, which I think often people don't perceive simply because they don't think it could be a joke, even if they read it and think it's funny. I think a lot of people say, yeah, but that can't be right because there's a critic. But I try to build in a certain amount of humor. I craft the essays very carefully. I want them to be readable. I want it to flow, but and I want them to be easy to read. But that's not the same as easy to understand. All right. So I want to basically sucker them into my writing in order to get what I think are often some very complicated and controversial and challenging ideas on the table in front of them. And the best way I know to do that is not to be off-putting with them, but to be engaging in various ways, so that so it's. And I have people who have told me that they read me and are not even interested in photography. They're just like reading me, which is lovely, right? Because it sort of validates that I'm achieving something like that. I'm creating an inviting atmosphere in the writing itself that allows people to enter into it and deal then with the ideas at whatever level of understanding and reference points, etc., that they have. And if I'm good enough at it, I'll actually interest them enough that they'll go and get the reference points that they don't have, which would be fantastic. So that's me. But I think that's, I mean, I think that, I don't want to be really prescriptive here, but I think every public intellectual should try to do that. I see someone like Noam Chomsky doing that all the time. You know, he's a terrific speaker, and he speaks very clearly. I mean, he talks about incredibly complicated stuff, and he simplifies it. And he makes it so available and so clear. It doesn't matter whether you agree with him or not, right? But he just makes it engaging to engage with the material that he that he thinks matters.
Alan, we're getting a bit of a buzz from your mic.
Okay, let me plug and unplug.
Actually, maybe I'll pick up on something that comes to mind here, Alan.
He might be able to.
Okay. No.
No, no. Test, 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 test. 1, 2. I wish I knew poetry offhand. I don't have anything poetic.
Test. I can hear you.
That's good. Yeah.
Not yet?
No. You're good. You're good.
Hold on.
Can you hear us? Test, Alan?
You got me?
Yeah. Do you have us?
Okay.
Great.
Yes, I can hear you fine. I can hear you fine.
Great.
Yep.
Okay. Actually, I had.
So as I was saying, I see people who can do this, and in a certain sense, they're my models, regardless of whether I agree with their, let's call it, their content or not, right, or their messages or not. I see people who are available who are concerned with making whatever it is that they have to deliver available and engaging to people. And then there are people who like to be very standoffish and difficult and so forth, and that's fine. I mean, it's a taste, right? It's and some people have a taste for that, and some people acquire a taste for that, and some people don't, and that's also fine. I think the point is really to understand, to have a sense of who, as a communicator, if we think of all of us, visual artists, critics, etc., as communicators, right? To have a sense of who we want our audience to be and what voice or voices we are speaking to them in.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful, and what it brings to mind, and for an artist, is something like, what's the who or what is the subjectivity to which the viewer seems to be responding, and I have a few thoughts around this. One of them is that if I think about people being interested in reading what you write, I imagine in a lot of cases that they may come to a point where they think they can hear you speaking. So there's a sense that there's a particular individual's voice, Alan Coleman. I get how he thinks. I know how he thought last week about something, and now I'm following that with how I understand him to be thinking this week. And I'm thinking that with modern and contemporary art, certainly I think we did have certainly with modern art, I think there was a sense that people wanted to know what that crazy Picasso was going to do next. Mm-hmm. So I think modernism really had that in spades, and I think today that exists and it doesn't exist. I do think that some artists draw some viewers to their work because the viewer really has a sense that this is what this artist with a particular name is doing, and I want to know what they're going to do next. And on the other hand, I think there's a certain amount of contemporary art that we might think of as so-called postmodern, where it's, I think we're interested in the artist, but I think we're also interested in the aboutness of the art and the kind of art it is and what it's doing. And I don't think I'm going to make a very good analysis here, but I'll try it anyway. I was thinking about, I studied with Jeff Wall at in Vancouver, and I would say that in as much, I know him, and I know him to be a very cerebral guy and an amazing thinker and an amazing artist, and at the same time, if I think of what people are drawn to in his work, I don't think it's so much they're wondering, what kind of guy is Jeff Wall really like? They're really sort of drawn to the world that he's kind of inventing or he's referring to. Whereas if I think, and maybe it's not a good antithesis, kind of, if I think of somebody like Cindy Sherman, I imagine people really think about Cindy Sherman not only as an amazing artist, but what kind of person she is in herself, and as she kind of gets on these get-ups and all this sort of thing. So what am I saying? I'm saying that I think that that, and maybe it's true in the writing world, the criticism world too, that there are these different registers or levels on which people are kind of relating to the individual voice of the writing art making subject. I think that certainly the modern paradigm was to be really drawn to what the genius artist was going to do next. And today I think it varies quite a bit in terms of, and maybe it also varies in part because of media. That might be a generalization, but because on the other hand, somebody like Ryan Tecarton, he seems like somebody people are drawn to because of his outrageousness and his group of friends, whereas there's all kinds of other video work where I would be less conscious of the maker of the video and more conscious of what the work is actually doing in front of me. So I don't know if there's anything there for you.
Yeah. Well, I think that we have today a celebrity-driven culture, and that this has seeped into the art world, whereas you had a few artists who worked at being Dali worked at being a celebrity, as well as an artist, right? And maybe even more of a celebrity than an artist over time. But I wouldn't say that Picasso really worked at being a celebrity. He sort of became a celebrity, and enjoyed it and even played it. But when you look at his enormous output, it's vast. This is a guy who basically spent most of his time, when he wasn't having an enjoyable social, sexual, gastronomic life, spent most of his time in the studio. Every day. I once got to see. I was in the south of France, in Arles, a little village down there, and they have a little museum. And like every museum in France and probably every museum in Spain, they had a Picasso donation. And what Picasso gave them was basically 1 day's output. And I don't think it was an on day. It was an off day, right? but it was mostly drawings and a couple little gouaches or watercolors or whatever, right? And he was just using whatever the hell paper was around. And it was about 80 or 90 pieces. But I actually learned more about Picasso and his method from this than anything else, because first of all, it was like 90 pieces 1 day, 90 pieces, and he was working on a Minotaur stuff, and so he would do it in the Cubist style, then he would tear it apart and do it in the classical Renaissance style, but he'd add this and he'd add that, and it was like shirt cardboards and newspaper and whatever was there, and you could just see this is what he did. This is what he did all day long. Every day he did this. So whatever celebrity was happening, he was exploiting it, but he wasn't making it happen. It wasn't his concentration. How can I become more celebrated? I think his concentration probably was how can I get people to leave me alone. But now we're in this celebrity environment where everything that artists do functions in this context of gossip, for want of a better term, or maybe that is the better term. Where you know who you're sleeping with, and who you've slept with, and how much money you've made, and how much money your pieces are selling for, etc., all becomes part of this environment in which the work exists. And the problem is that once that stuff creeps in, you can't get it out. You can't get it out of your head, right? It gets very hard to look at a Van Gogh without dollar signs on it when one sells for $220 million or whatever it sells for to a Japanese collector who's bought it as a trophy item. So I see that as a problem for the arts, for somebody who really just wants to make their work and find an audience, right? That to do that without getting caught up in this celebrity environment and becoming a celebrity. Yeah, and Daniel Boorstin's classic definition of celebrity was a person who was well known for being well known. And I see that as a real problem. And in a certain way, it's why I took my initials for my pen name. One of the reasons, right, was that it allowed me to remain invisible while going around to galleries and museums for about 2 years until people began to know who I was and spot me and point me out. Right? But I had this little bubble of invisibility, and I really liked it. And there are times, restaurant critics do this all the time. They go in and they're anonymous, right? Nobody's supposed to know who they are when they come in, and I sort of like that idea. I think that idea has value for the critic, and maybe value for the artist, because I don't think it really matters in understanding my work anyhow. What my personal life has been, what my financial issues are, etc., how much I made from this article or that article. I guarantee you it's never been scandalously high. I just don't think it's important. But this has become a driving force in the culture, and so it becomes a kind of unspoken or even spoken expectation put on artists, put on writers. Publishers want to work with writers who are going to be book publishers who are going to be proactive, which means they want you out there on the trail flogging that book, which is no longer their job; it's your job, by the way, as a writer. Somehow to get bookstores to buy your book and to do readings and to do all of this other stuff, except writing the next book. Right?
Yeah.
So I think galleries are probably the same. They want you out there promoting your work and running your website and working your social network and and so forth and so on. Everything's at painting the next painting. Right?
Yeah, well, and I think that for a younger artist to not be aware of that, at least at some level, and make some choices is naive. Yeah. On the other hand, to be driven by it. This is a slightly sad and pathetic story I'll tell on myself. I was doing a residency in a studio in New York for about 3 months, we'll say about 5 or 6 years ago, and they arranged studio visits, so I would have these people come into my studio, and pretty soon I realized that they would come in. I mean, some of them were nice enough and even said polite things about the work, but they would look at me and think, here's a 50-year-old Canadian artist we've never heard of, so why would we be interested now? And so there was, it was an education for me, but it was an education both in how the world works, but also that there are choices to be made. And I think if any artist should be actually aware of how the game works, and certainly aware of what they're choosing to kind of partake of or not.
Right. I remember someone telling me, this is years ago, it's got to be 30 years ago, that when they got their Guggenheim in photography, they did what you're supposed to do, which was go around the country showing everybody your work and telling them that you got a Guggenheim. And I said, what about your project proposal? He said, oh, I'll do that. But I mean, that's not what the Guggenheim was for. The Guggenheim was for basically promoting myself. And I said, and that's how you're supposed to use it? Oh, he says, everybody knows that. But don't you know that? And I thought, silly me, I didn't know that. I actually thought that you were going to use the money to fulfill the project that you I think it's there are problems here, right? I mean, I would like to think that it should be possible or was possible once for there to exist, what I think of was a healthier relationship between the market, the let's call them gatekeepers, critics, gallerists, museum curators, collectors, etc., and the audience, the serious audience for work. I think there was a healthier symbiosis there, a healthier ecology there at one point, and I think that ecology has gotten seriously skewed. I'm horrified, for example, at the idea of schools inviting collectors in to look at student work. I'm horrified. I think it's appalling. I think it should actually be criminalized. And you're welcome to disagree, but I hope the reasoning is clear, which is that from my standpoint, your educational experience should be a cocoon. You should be free to fall on your face and experiment and fail in ways that you will not be able to experiment and fail when you're out there in what we used to call the real world. Because you're not going to have that chance again, and to my mind, that's what you're paying for in your educational environment is the privilege of failure without penalty, of failed experiments without penalty, and to take that away and basically make it a kind of launching pad for the market. I just find it appalling, and it's now just a given. I mean, I remember back when I was teaching at NYU, and we were starting, or the department that I was in was starting to do that in a very small way, and I would get up at faculty meetings and I would say, this is bad, and it's going to get worse, and pretty soon you're not even going to remember why it was bad, but I'm telling you it's bad. But I'm an old-fashioned guy. What can I tell you? So there you go.
Well, no, I mean I understand where you're coming from, and certainly I would be closer to you than those who would say, this is what we're here to do.
Right.
I think where this program is happening, where a little off the beaten track in terms of a major market, if there is any in Canada, and so it's a little harder to get collectors to come here anyway. But I would say, that also kind of runs parallel to what's happening in universities, certainly sometimes in Canada, where science models of training versus education are being are being propounded. So in a certain sense, you could say some of what goes on in institutions with artists is about trying to sort of make them market ready. On the other hand, I think the university is trying to make artists results ready, or to sort of encourage an environment where everybody's being trained, and everything that they're being trained to do is going to be manifested in their results. And so I think that on the one hand, as one of my former students and allies here, Gabriella, will tell you, I mean, in the sciences, failure is valuable. But I think in some ways we have adopted science models in universities, and that has not allowed us to encourage failure, because we're supposed to be sort of making sure that people are being visibly trained to succeed in one way or another, which is a little ironic if you think about being artists.
Well, even listen to the language you're using, trained. Training was never a word used in higher education when I was going to college. No one would ever say they were there for purposes of training. Certainly not in the humanities.
Yeah.
But that idea that it's going to be results oriented, results driven, success driven, and if this is the result of adopting the science model, it's a false version of the science model, because yes, a success in science, an experiment can fail and it was successful.
Yeah.
Because you proved that nobody needs to go down that path.
Yes.
So that's a contribution to the body of knowledge. That your hypothesis can fail. Not that you have a bad experiment, but your hypothesis can fail, right? So you proved that was wrong. That's a contribution. but we don't really have that in the humanities, and there's in a certain way there's no way to have it in the humanities because experiments aren't repeatable. And so that's a whole set of problems in itself. But the whole environment has become so market driven.
Mm-hmm.
And frankly, if I had to pinpoint a cause for this, I would say real estate. That is real estate is the single driving force of the entire art industry in the world at this point, because you cannot live la vie boheme on a bohemian income anymore.
Yeah.
And for that reason, and that's because primarily not because the cost of everything have risen astronomically, but the cost of your residential space, which is also going to be your working space, has risen astronomically.
Yeah.
And therefore, in order to afford your working space, you have to be making a certain amount of your living and working space. You have to, in any urban environment, just about anywhere, in at least in the Western world, you have to be making enough money that you can no longer live la vie boheme, which means you're not going to have the time to do your work that you would have had, which was the luxury that the la vie boheme afforded you. You know, you ate cheaply, you lived in little inexpensive apartments, you had a little dinky job somewhere, and you had time to do your work. And that was la vie boheme. And you can't do that just about anywhere anymore. Now, I know Canada is much more lavish than we are down here with money for artists. and believe me, among the many things we envy you is that. Probably more money for critics, too, I'm willing to wager. But the fact of the matter is, even so, I suspect that you guys up there find it tougher to live la vie boheme than John Max and Leonard Cohen and people did in Toronto or Montreal in the 1950s, and it's the big change is real estate. Everything else, food, clothing, etc. It's not that hard to piece that money together, but rent is the killer.
Yeah.
So,
Like it's really kind of said.
Yeah.
It's true.
I have a little question.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I was reading your spiritual. I read a bunch of your essays, but the spirituality and teaching one, and I worked through a number of things that you were doing and really liked them. I mean, Freire and a whole number of and Lewis Hyde. I've always been really interested in, but then I got to the word hope, and I even liked your kind of definition of hope. And so I'm going to ask you about that, but it brought to mind, I was working with a group of artists. We're working on a project about water, and we have an exhibition up right now. We had this water policy guy come and meet with us about a year ago. And even though he had a daughter who was an artist, he was appalled at how, well, for him, I think, how in some ways cynical, or at the very least realistic, the artists seemed to be, and what he seemed to be looking for were the artists to be the kind of harbingers of hope, or the bringers of something almost like optimism. And so it was an interesting. He was a smart guy, but he was obviously kind of a romantic when it came to what he thought the job of the artist was. And so we kind of worked through that and had a really interesting session. But when I came across the word hope in your essay, and then at the same time you said, but it doesn't need to be, it's not necessarily about optimism. It reminded me of a critique I was involved in with one of our students, where it came to me to say, you seem very pessimistic to me, or at least skeptical, and I think that that's an absolutely defensible position. But now you have to get on and be very robust about making your work. And so to me, that's about as close as I could come to anything like hope for the artists. I wonder, you gave that talk a while ago. I wonder, if you've thought any more about this. You seem pretty upbeat in terms of getting on with it, but is hope still a possible term?
Well, as I recall, I'm not actually defining it myself. I'm quoting Václav Havel.
Right, that's right.
Right, who if anybody exemplifies the difference between optimism and hope, here's a guy who was in jail in the Czech Republic, and ends up being the president of not the Czech Republic, the former Czechoslovakia, and ends up being the president of the Czech Republic. Um, and I think his point was that, as I can't recall the exact wording, but he says something to the effect that hope is the conviction that there's a reason to go on doing the right thing, even if you have no assurance that the outcome will be positive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? And I absolutely still believe that. And I'm not an optimist, and he distinguishes it from optimism, which is the belief that everything's going to turn out right, right?
Yeah.
I'm not at all an optimist about that. In fact, I've become, in that sense, more of a pessimist than ever before. I think Western culture, and certainly U.S. culture, and I'll distinguish it from you guys, although we'll take you down with us, no doubt. But I think we're on a downward slide. I think I've seen my culture at its peak, and I think we're on a downward slide, and I have serious doubts that that's reversible.
Yeah, I would have to agree with you. And at the same time, this is where, for me as an artist and somebody teaching art, I still need some way in which I see the job of the artist as not only viable, but necessary and actually productive in all the ways that it can possibly be productive. And so I think that, yeah, I'm not advocating optimism, but I definitely am advocating artists basically taking control of their work, if nothing else. And I mean, I think that is potentially what artists always need to do. But more than anything, I think sometimes we're seeing really exciting art being made by people who are pessimistic but also highly engaged, and to me that's a great thing. I mean, that's what makes it worth continuing to do this kind of work.
I don't think it's contradictory to say that I'm pessimistic and hopeful, and I don't think Havel would say that that's contradictory either. I believe, for example, I believe in the idea of the historical record, and I believe that there is some value to my putting down what I'm experiencing during what I see as this downward slide that I'm talking about, by putting this down on paper, or in pixels or whatever, even knowing that all of that stuff may absolutely disappear in a blink. It will take one terrorist with access to a nuclear weapon, and it could all be gone, at any moment. And yet, I believe that there is some value to my doing that, to other people doing that, in whatever forms we choose, because we're creating some kind of account of our time here. Whatever our impressions of it are and our attitudes towards it are, and we're leaving that to the future, and that is an act of hope. Not because we are convinced that there will be a future, but because if there is a future, we believe it will be a good thing for this stuff to be around, for them to look at and maybe learn from. So I mean, that gets me out of bed every morning. I mean, that and the cats and my wife and my stepson, get me out of bed, and and that it's enough. It's enough. It's enough of a motive. It's enough of a motive to think and to know, because I've had it happen, that somebody I have never ever met is gonna and know nothing about is gonna come across something I have published, sometimes in the most unlikely place, and find something in it that resonates. And once in a blue moon, I will hear from a person like that, and it's a little gift. It's a little gift from the gods that I can do this and affect the life of some total stranger someplace. And to have had, I mean, I could complain endlessly about the loss of platforms and the difficulty of finding platforms for what I do, etc., and the lack of support for it, all of that stuff. But to have had readers, the number of readers I've had, just that is a gift for a writer.
Mm-hmm.
Just that, all by itself, you know. So I think we have to value the chance that we have to communicate with other people and take that seriously. What we do with it is, you know, we could debate that endlessly, but to recognize the preciousness of that gift, you know, to communicate to other people that comes our way, at least from time to time. If you do what you do, or if I do what I do, or if the other people in the room up there do what they do, you know, that's just something to give thanks for.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and to try to do our best. You know, I mean, I have never ever, and I would hope this is true of you in your way as an artist, I have never ever slacked off on a piece. You know, I mean, I'm not saying every piece I've written is great or even good, and there's some stuff that's very forgettable, right? And there's even a couple of things that are bad. Uh, but I've never said to myself in any situation, regardless of what I was being paid or if I was being paid or how many people were going to read it, etc. I've never said I'm going to blow this off.
Yeah.
You know, I just can't. I systemically cannot do that. Every opportunity is an opportunity, and I do the very best I can with every single opportunity, and I am completely uncynical about that still after all these years.
Yeah, I really appreciate all of that, and actually, you know, two things. One is that that's the kind of advice I always give students, and I give myself is, you know, if I can manage it, you know, nothing is too small to not at least be considered or too large to be shot for. And also that, you know, my experience is that oftentimes that little opportunity that I thought, well, I'll just do it. If I've done a good job, it might have turned into something remarkable. And those big moments that were going to make me a star, maybe it didn't. Maybe it didn't pan out.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that I don't have a lot of control over, in quotes, what's worth doing, and so I just have to be to decide that it's all in the best sense worth doing. The other thing I was thinking is, in addition to the opportunity to do the kind of valuable work that we're doing, that you're talking about, I also think when I look around and I see some of the artwork being made by artists, that really is representing a kind of nuance. And I think artists, especially modern and contemporary artists, have to somehow deal in nuance. I think sometimes those moments that end up being reflected upon, that represent the times in which we're living, you know, I think artists are actually making profound statements in sometimes small ways that really are the kinds of things, and I wish I could give a good example here, but I don't think I will. But I think those are the kinds of things that also make you, or remind me that great art continues to be made. You know, I don't have to go to Europe to see works from the Renaissance. I think great works are being made because they're really speaking to us, and also I think are being made ready, or being made in such a way that they could speak to a future.
I honestly can't think of a better note to end on. Saying that, I will pan the room to make sure that there's nobody who has a pressing. Well, thank you, Patrick. Thank you for your contribution today. Thank you, Alan,
Thanks,
as always.
Alan.
A pleasure always.
Looking forward to the next version of this in the future.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and have a great 4th of July.
Okay. You guys too. Well, you don't do 4th of July up there, or do you? What do you do?
We do Canada Day tomorrow.
Oh, happy Canada. So you all get together and sing, "Oh, Canada"? Give me "Oh, Canada." Come on, I want "Oh, Canada."
Okay, yeah.
Do it?
Do it. No, we're not doing it. We don't do patriotism the way you do.
Oh, but you know "Oh, Canada."
That's pretty bad.
Okay. You won't give me "Oh, Canada." All right. Okay, I won't sing the Star Spangled Banner. Take that.
Slowly reach over. Take
So
care.
long, folks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.